Hi, I'm Joy Lodico, and this is CogX Spotlight, 1 hour where we shine a light on developments in leadership, business, and technology. This week is all about the moonshot makers. We are coming live from Scalespace, Imperial College's new business hub in West London, and we're going to be looking at the superpowers of science, technology, and research and asking, how do you create national competitive advantage? How do you achieve 50-year goals? We've had great news this week as a third vaccine, this one from Oxford University, is looking to be 90% effective. Never in history has one vaccine, let alone three, been developed so fast. Boris Johnson has called for a green industrial revolution, which means a boost to research on carbon storage and hydrogen technologies. And there will be £16 billion over 4 years going into the defence budget, creating a national cyber force, a space command, and a new agency for AI. It extends British influence, but it also fits into another plan, that of how the UK transforms itself post-Brexit into a superpower in scientific research. There's a blueprint for a new ARPA on the desk of the Prime Minister. The original ARPA, the US government's Advanced Research Programme Agency in the 1960s, proved a hotbed of innovation, leading to the internet, GPS, and Siri. We've got the ingredients for it to happen here and now. The UK has 4 of the 5 top research universities in Europe, and Oxford, one of them, has just shown what it can do. And we have the business environment. But how do we harness it all? We're going to pick up these themes through the hour, talking about vaccines with Baroness Blackwood and GSK's Sally Mossman, and consider how to create that 50-year research plan with Hayatun Silum. But first, where it all starts, universities. Is it time to rethink them? We are delighted to be joined by Sir Martin Rees, Astronomer Royal, and Professor Robert Dijkgraaf, theoretical physicist and director of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, once the academic home of Albert Einstein. Yolanda Ohene is chairing the discussion.
Thank you, Joy. My name's Yolanda Ohene, and we're going to be talking about should we be rethinking research and universities. So today I'm joined with Robert Dijkgraaf, who's a theoretical physicist and the director for Advanced Studies in Princeton. Hello, Robert.
Great to see you. A pleasure to be with you.
Great to welcome you here. And we're also joined by the eminent cosmologist, Martin Reeves. Good afternoon, Martin.
Hi, hello. Good to be with you too.
How do you think that the UK research institutes and universities should be shape-shifting to the future, and what should we be doing post-Brexit so that we remain world leaders for research?
Right. Well, let me say first of all that Europe is very strong in scientific research, and it's been strengthening in the last 30 years, partly because of EU collaboration, and in particular in the so-called big sciences where you have to have massive equipment. Then Europe is the world leader in particle physics at CERN and in astronomy at the European Southern Observatory. We are way ahead of the United States. Brexit is a real self-inflicted wound, obviously for Britain, but it's going to be bad for Europe as well because Britain is a strong research centre. So I think Brexit is, for many ways, a disaster.
Yes, and hopefully not too much of a disaster. And I suppose looking towards the US, Robert, you're the director for the Institute for Advanced Studies, which is kind of takes a different approach for research, and it was founded in the 30s. Now, could you just tell us a little bit more about the centre?
Well, I think the Institute is very different than many other research institutes because it's somehow very simple principles. It's trying to attract the best people from the world and then essentially get out of the way. So when particularly young researchers come here, they are fully empowered to continue their own research program. Our professors are basically not evaluated. There is no grants application. So I think it's kind of a wonderful experiment that has shown to be extremely successful. I don't think it's for no reason that Albert Einstein actually decided to come here. And I think it also points to something which I think is a great strength of the United States, is that it has a great diversity of institutions. There are research universities, small colleges, There are places like my institute, which is basically not really replicated anywhere. And I think it's this rich ecosystem that actually helps to foster and advance the research enterprise. And there are many things wrong in the United States, but I think one thing that people have this sense of experimentation also at the level of institutions. And I must say, it's partly also possible because we are to a large extent a private organization. So we're supported by philanthropy, by individuals who care for this kind of lofty mission of pushing research without any attention to immediate applications.
And what do you say to kind of the naysayers who are saying, should we allow just this intellectual freedom of exploration?
Well, I think it's what I would say, it's not everything should be like this, but it's a crucial ingredient in the whole spectrum of research. And actually, if I look into the future and see the enormous challenges that we have as a world and how to educate our young people and produce more breakthrough research, I think we need better ideas. We need more creativity. And it's there's such a potential for scientific discovery, for new ways of thinking, that we need places where people feel liberated.
And Martin, do you think that the UK should be looking towards these kind of institutions within our university system?
Well, I think places like Oxford and Cambridge have essentially all the benefits of the Princeton Institute, but I do share Robert's view that there should be some places where people can just do sort of blue skies research. And to take one obvious example, mentioning Einstein, the laser was invented in 1960. It used ideas, some of which came from Einstein 40 years earlier, and the people who invented it had no idea that the laser would be used for DVDs and eye surgery and things like that. So the transition from some basic ideas to the technology is very long term and involves lots of styles of thinking. So we do need to have people who can think far ahead.
And also, just to kind of move on to your point about the blue skies research, yes. How do you think that we can continue to encourage perhaps the brightest minds to pursue blue skies research as opposed to perhaps going into finance, going into startups, which is an ever-increasing trend?
Well, I make a distinction. I think it's dismaying how many of our brightest students go into finance. So, and I when I was head of a college, I used to give the graduation day, and I said, some of you guys who are going into finance and faffing around with financial derivatives is far further away from the real world than what's done here, making relationships and having ideas. So the finance, we want far fewer people doing that, but we do want people doing startups. And I think these will be people who may come from research. And incidentally, Cambridge is very good at this. We have lots of startups around Cambridge. And in fact, I'm on the advisory board for a recently established a venture capital fund called Arum. And this advisory board contains 2 Nobel Prize winners, 2 presidents of the Royal Society, the man who invented the world's best-selling drug, Sir Greg Winter, the man who invented the gene sequencing used by Illumina, and the man who invented the iris recognition thing used in the identity cards for 1 billion Indians. And so we do have these people who are on the faculty at Cambridge who have had huge success in startups, as well as being academics. So you can combine the two. And in Cambridge, we are lucky to have a sort of not very large city where there's real interaction between these. So the environment where there's an interaction between innovative ideas and academia works very well in Cambridge.
And I suppose perhaps now's a good time to mention your book on the future. And so perhaps can you just give us a few ideas that you touch upon within that book?
Right. Well, my book on the future really was, from my perspective as an astronomer, where we think in terms of long time scales. But my main point was that even though the Earth's been around for 45 million centuries, and it'll be around for 6 60 million more. This century is special. It's the first when one species, the human species, has the future of the planet in its hands, because there are more of us, they're more empowered by technology. And my book is mainly addressing how technology can be used to help us. Now, we know that the world will last for billions of years, but nonetheless, things are going to change between one generation and the next. And this means that we've got to have flexibility in our institutions. I think it's very important.
And I suppose, speaking about technologies, this is often seen as kind of the application of some of the fundamental principles discovered. And yes. I suppose this kind of perhaps touches a little bit on your book, Robert, about the usefulness of useless knowledge, which is a great title. And I suppose it's in joint with the founder of your institute, Abraham Flexner. And so perhaps you can tell us a few of the ideas in this book.
In order to have the real breakthroughs that we need in this society, we just have to be able to concentrate on basic research, understanding the fundamental issues underlying the problem. So there's so many examples now. Think about everything that's happening in the biomedical sphere, even now as we speak, around COVID. Now that would not have been possible if people were not intensely curious in understanding the molecular basis of life, DNA, RNA, proteins, etc. Quantum mechanics was a exotic field in the 1920s. There's just a handful of physicists were interested in understanding how does an atom work. And now we are using it everywhere. I think it's estimated that 30% of our economy is based on quantum mechanics. And I would like to say 100% of reality is based on quantum mechanics. And we get going into a world now where quantum computers exist. So if we really take these lessons serious, we know we have to concentrate on the difficult problems. We have to understand the underlying issues. There's a wonderful ability, I think, of the human mind to envision things that are not here yet, to concentrate on the great unknown. And that's, I think it's a mystery, it's a wonder how effective it has been in the past. And I think, I'm sure Martin agrees that we have only started to explore this great unknown. There are so many much more interesting and fundamental problems there. Yes. So I think that's the great challenge for every society.
No, I agree. I just like to make 2 points. I mean, the first is that it's crucially important that academia remains attractive to the brightest young people. And I do worry it's getting more bureaucratic, promotions getting slower, etc. And you'll always get the nerds, people like me who can't do anything else. But you need to get the kind of people who are ambitious and want to feel they've achieved something distinctive by their 30s. And that's now harder in academia than it used to be. And you've got to make sure that we don't lose just those people who are going to be the most creative and most energetic. But I completely agree that people should have the chance to do research and long-term research. And indeed, also in universities, there's now pressure to produce your papers every year, etc., which militates against some of the best kinds of research. But on the other hand, we mustn't be academic snobs. We mustn't say that it's more intellectually elite to do blue skies research and applications. And I like to quote an old cartoon, which all my engineering friends like, which shows 2 beavers looking up at a big hydroelectric dam. And one beaver says to the other, I didn't actually build it, but it's based on my idea. And that shows in a realistic way the balance between the effort of having the idea and the often much greater effort of turning it into some entity that works and fulfills a human need, which is what engineers do. So we should be a bit modest and not be sort of elite about academia.
But if I can add something, I think the qualities that we see very clearly in basic research, the creativity, the depth of ideas, that's something that we need in every field, in every, I would say, any domain of human life. And one thing I noticed, for instance, when I talked about my book, that people in education, people in the tech sector, people in business, people in government, said, well, we need some kind of useless knowledge too, right? We should also feel the freedom to explore, even in very, very applied situations. So I think it's not so much a distinction between various walks of life. It's more a certain spirit where you empower human creativity, which I think is something we really need for the future.
And just to kind of follow on from there, thinking about creativity, how, as academics, do we begin to attract kind of a wider pool and wider diversity of people into academia, and especially this year, given kind of the social awakening of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how we move past equality, diversity and inclusion just being a box ticking exercise to really being embedded within the institutions and the universities that we're from.
We wanted to try and do this, and of course we need more role models. We don't have enough, but I think that it is hard because to end up with someone who can be a researcher does require them to have had an education, etc. And it's very hard if someone has had bad luck in their first 10 years of life for them to catch up. We've got to do everything we can, and I certainly feel we ought to have a more flexible admissions policy and try and get people who may not have got over the hoops. And that's why I'm very keen on the idea of not just selecting people over one bar at the age of 18 in universities. We've got to allow people a second chance and to come in. And I think Oxford and Cambridge should certainly do this. They should keep some fractal their places for those who don't come straight from school, but come having done some part-time education or caught up later. So we've got to do more in order to get the variety in, because not only do we need to do this for social justice and fairness, but because we want the greatest variety of creativity in the university, and that will be helped the more of the people we have from different backgrounds. And of course, in physical sciences, there's still a very big gender imbalance, which is only changing rather slowly, and it's changing slowly because it takes a long time to rebalance people in academia, because your reputation in academia depends far too much actually on cumulative record. And so someone who's had a slow start in their career, etc., is going to be handicapped through life in academic appointments if they're done in a traditional way, where you used to look at how many papers people have written, etc. That's not done in other walks of life. There, you look at what people will do in the next 5 years. Well, academics have to, I think, have a wider set of criteria in deciding appointments.
I fully agree. I think we should widen the opening gate, so to say. But I think we should also rebuild the house that lies behind it. I think the culture of science in general. I think academia is narrow-minded. People should feel at home. I think actually it will be very positive, not only for the quality of research, but also for the kind of spirit and the new ways of collaborating. But also I think if we truly take equity serious, it means that it's not just opening the gate, but actually thinking that some people have to travel from much further to come there. So there is a lot that has to be done to reach out much earlier. It's wonderful that you and others are doing this, and coach people, and perhaps also we should be less narrow-minded about what kind of qualities we see. I think people can be very talented in one element, not so much in another, and by some sense having too many constraints, I think you get exactly what you predict. And so I think it's also opening the minds of the academic community itself that has to happen. I think it will be accelerated if we have a more diverse audience, and there are still so many, I think, biases. And perhaps the most difficult one is the kind of social bias. I think it's very difficult if you're in a different social strata to actually come up. And in fact, there are some ways you could even argue that this has become worse because of all the convoluted entry criteria in top universities, that the stories of rough talent being found and then blossoming in the university becomes more and more difficult. I think there's some kind of a regression happening at this point.
What do you think that research really has to do for the future to maintain social progress?
Well, we've got to obviously continue with the idea of discovering new things, because the second half of the century may be dominated by some technology we can't conceive yet. So it's important that we have some people doing that. But I think the main point is to ensure that all the science we already have is applied beneficially and avoid the downsides, but also applied to the whole world. We've talked about inequality within a country, but what's even worse is the inequalities between nations. And in particular, what's going to be crucially important is to ensure that, for instance, Africa, where the population is growing fast, etc., doesn't lag behind the rest. And so we've got to make sure that the benefits which are enjoyed by those of us in countries like the UK and the US do spread. And so we hope to have a less unequal world. If it's not more unequal, it's going to be a very sort of disturbed and embittered world. So we've got to aim for more equality and more balance, and something like a sort of grand Marshall Plan, like the way the Americans helped Europe after World War II, to help Africa, so that it doesn't lag behind the rest of the world. So we need to make the world more balanced, because the one thing we learned from the pandemic is that we are interconnected. We can't have a disaster in one continent without the other. And in Africa, they all have mobile phones. They may not have toilets, but they have mobile phones, so they know what they're missing. They know the injustice of their fate. Unless we do something about that, we will have an embittered and turbulent world.
And Robert, perhaps you can have one final quick closing remark.
Well, I think it's no doubt that science and technology will become even more important to the future. The question is, can we accept it? Will we connect? So I think it's crucial that you actually make sure that society is connected to science, understands it, accepts it, but also that science listens to society, its needs, its worries, and that we together can actually build that future.
Thanks, Yolanda, and welcome back. That was exciting, visionary, and even occasionally a little bit radical. I'm delighted to be joined by Ed Vaizey, recently ennobled as Lord Vaizey. He was going to be commentating on that talk. He was previously Minister for All Things Digital, and he's now also the host and author of The Vaizey View, the highly subscribable podcast and newsletter on tech and culture. How are you, Ed? How is the ermine suiting you these days?
It's very good. It's right up my street.
Good. Keeping you cozy. Listen, I thought that was a very interesting discussion. Martin started talking about how universities were more bureaucratic, promotions were getting slower. Robert Dijkgraaf was talking about the need to rebuild institutions, and both of them were throwing in ideas about flexible learning, specialization, splitting undergrad and postgrad. This is all kind of talk like a kind of dynamic business or even a tech company. From your experience in government, do you think universities are ready for that level of disruption?
Well, I think we constantly have to reinvent the university. And to a certain extent, this has been going on for 30 or 40 years. It started under Margaret Thatcher, who was very unpopular with the universities, but she did at least, I think, challenge them to become more commercial, by which I mean that pure research being applied to technology solutions was not something that British universities did very well, and American universities have been much better. But universities have come on leaps and bounds since then, and Martin was referring to the startup ecosystem that exists outside Cambridge. It also exists outside Oxford and many other universities like Manchester and Birmingham. And I think while we shouldn't rest on our laurels, we should recognise, obviously, that the UK is one of the world-leading countries in terms of university research and the quality of our universities. But we do have to reinvent them. And I particularly picked up, I think, on what Martin was saying about different style of degrees. It's bizarre, particularly in a world of tuition fees and, as it were, the student becoming much more of a consumer, that you still seem to have this one-size-fits-all degree, that you sign up for 3 years and that's it, and you go to lectures. people should potentially be able to dip in and out of a university education. Somebody like me, a 52-year-old washed up has-been, should potentially be able to reinvent himself, perhaps by making it very easy for me to do an online degree. So I think that kind of thing is very interesting. One thing that Martin and Robert didn't talk about were apprenticeships, where again, I think, as it were, the reinvention back to the future of apprenticeships and giving people the chance to work in technology while getting a degree is something that we should look at. And the final point I want to make is the link between business and university needs to be much more permeable. As well as having flexible degrees, we should have, I think, flexible professorships. If you're running a great cybersecurity company and you cash out, why not go and spend 3 years as a professor at university with real up-to-the-minute experience of cybersecurity teaching students?
Okay, we're actually in Scale Space, which is the Imperial kind of business growth hub at the moment. So we hopefully are kind of part of that long-term vision that started with Thatcher. I've got one very brief question for you. Martin Rees dared to mention the B word, Brexit. After all the collaboration among European institutions, he said Brexit was now a self-inflicted wound. If the UK wants to be a research leader, what can it do alone, or does it need to go back to Europe?
Look, I think that I'm no fan of Brexit, and I agree with Martin that it is a self-inflicted wound. There is, however, a sort of counter-argument, which it does sound like a sort of, I'm channeling my inner purist Brexit, which is there is an element of British universities being quite sort of complacent and comfortable just linking with European universities. And Brexit might actually, and I absolutely accept I'm clutching at a silver lining here, kick us out of that complacency, engage us more, for example, in South Asia and China, for example, depending on the geopolitics. So there is that opportunity there. And the other thing I would say in terms of my experience in science and universities is that to a certain extent, universities really don't know any boundaries. You'll find potentially Iranians and Israelis working together in university research. So while Brexit is deeply unfortunate, we mustn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and European collaboration, I'm sure, will continue.
Great. Ed, we'll come back to you shortly, but moving on. So we've got all this talent in the universities, but what happens next? Is innovation just luck, or can you actually plan it out over, say, half a century? Hayatun Selim is the head of the Royal Academy of Engineering and is going to discuss this matter with Matt Clifford, founder of Entrepreneur First.
Thank you, Joy. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Clifford. I'm co-founder and CEO of Entrepreneur First. I'm excited to be here today with Hayatun Selim, Chief Executive of the Royal Academy of Engineering, to talk about how to create a 50-year research agenda, a topic that's close to both of our hearts. I thought a good place to start would be to sort of almost challenge the premise of the question, which is, why bother with a 50-year research agenda? It's a very long time. Like, why should we focus on the long term when it comes to research?
For me, research it's a down payment for a better future. It means investing to create capabilities that we can't today envisage are going to be possible, to enable us to do things we probably can't even imagine we're going to need. And that really long-term approach gives us the best possible chance of uncovering those important bits of knowledge, gaining those useful insights. Research, as you know, is a really slow and uncertain process. It works by, over time, laying down those different layers of knowledge, and usually only in retrospect can you see which are the ones that turned out to be important. And you could almost argue that most research results in failure, but even that failure is important for helping us navigate our way in the world. It helps us ask better targeted questions next time. And then lastly, I would just say, despite my excitement about this 50-year horizon, I would not advocate for a strategy that just told us what we wanted the world to be like in 50 years, because we're notoriously bad at crystal ball gazing, and it is right. So we might want to set ourselves some sort of milestones or some kind of guide as to what's going to happen along the way.
Yeah, there's so much there to unpack. I think, like, just drawing on one of the first things you said about sort of uncertainty, I think this is a really underappreciated point. I think if you look at the history of institutions like DARPA, which are now generally viewed as a huge success, if you cut them off after 10 years, there wouldn't have been much to show. And I think that touches on one of the challenges for this, which is you need your funders, which usually means in this case government, and therefore the public, have a lot of tolerance, both in terms of patience, but also in terms of tolerance for uncertainty and risk. Where do you think we are on that, and how can we create greater risk and time tolerance among the people that pay for research?
I think that we have very different relationships with risk in all aspects of our life. So there is, I wouldn't say a consistency in terms of how we treat risk across the various different aspects of, for example, where public funding is spent. So our appetite for risk on road safety is really different to our appetite for risk in procurement, etc., etc. And so I think with research, we have to accept that you cannot possibly know, you might perceive that you are constraining risk by trying to create some kind of more controlled environment at the outset. But all you're doing is cutting off options, as you say, before we can even ever have an insight into how useful they'll be over the longer term. So, and I think it's quite interesting that in risk, I think we're on average more comfortable with the idea that you have to trust researchers to decide what the right things are to study than perhaps is the case in innovation, where I think perhaps the perception that this money might be going more to the private sector means that we think that there's a higher price to risk and we're less comfortable with failure. I mean, you know a lot about this too, Matt, so I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Well, I think you're right, and that the interesting thing about innovation is that it has a built-in business model that is very risk tolerant, as in, my day job as a venture capitalist, we're very comfortable with things failing as long as the things that succeed on a magnitude that pays for everything else. One thing I'm struck by when I look at research, though, is that that's probably true at a societal level, as in the most impactful research is probably, pays for, in inverted commas, the stuff that doesn't work out 10 or 100, 1,000 times over. But because there isn't we don't measure that in cash, it can be difficult sometimes to persuade policymakers and other stakeholders of that. And so I'm always struck by, this question of how do we demonstrate that, it's sort of easy if it's, I say easy, but, it's sort of easier to make the case when it's curing cancer. But one of the things that you touched on is the importance of enabling layers of research, some of which will not look very sexy up front, right? And I think this question of how do we kind of build this sort of social and political capital to invest in long-term research when the payoff is less clear is a really tough one, and one that I'm not sure anyone has cracked.
Well, you think living through the global pandemic that we are all experiencing, that the notion that investing in research is a way of de-risking your futures, it's a form of insurance, would be a sort of logical argument that would perhaps land better now than at some points in our evolution.
I want to switch gears though, because I want to talk to you about how we actually do this. Sort of sometimes it can imagine that we just need to put a bunch of geniuses in a room and research will happen, and of course I'm pretty sure you're going to tell me that's not the case. What do you see as the enabling layers, if you like, that will actually allow us to make the most out of the research that we want to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my head, I have 3 P's and 2 I's. And the first P is what I am at least marginally obsessed with, and that's people. So you cannot deliver any kind of vision. You can't even develop your vision for the 50-year research strategy without a huge focus on the skilled people we're going to need to create that vision, to deliver that vision. And the talent base is just one of the key enablers, if not the most important enabler of the strategy. I really believe we need more creative ways of thinking about research and innovation talent. We've got to think about not this linear model of, you kind of go to school and then you might go to FE or HE and you pop out the other end a skilled person. We've got to think about converting in and out of careers, talent circulation so people can switch between sectors, between roles.
Yes.
Continuous upgrading of skills, upskilling, reskilling. We need people who are multilingual professionally. I mean, not just in terms of languages, but who can bridge between disciplines. So you think about ethics in technology, and you need people who understand how to bring together the social sciences and humanities with engineering and technology. And whilst I'm absolutely delighted to see the growing focus on the importance of diversifying our research innovation community and increasingly the recognition that we need a more inclusive culture. It's not just about diversity, which is sort of counting the number of people in each category. It's also about the culture that they then work within. But there is so much more to do. There's this incredibly powerful business case now about why we need diversity and inclusion. And I also think that, so much of the public funding we have to think who's sharing in the benefits of that. So to me, this is a kind of ongoing burning platform issue, notwithstanding the progress we're making. So that's
and there's something. Sorry,
Yeah.
Kat, or maybe just before you move to the second P, I think just picking up on something you said there, which I think is so important, is this idea of inter or multidisciplinarity. In that, I read a paper earlier this year that showed that if you try and kind of crudely divide research between sort of like incremental, which is obviously important, but then like fundamental that really changes the game. One of the striking characteristics of fundamental research is that it usually involves one or more discipline switches who are sort of actually bringing a new context to the problem. But in some ways, I think academia as is today almost encourages the opposite. The natural incentives are pulling towards more and more specialization. Do you think that's true? And if it is, what can we do to encourage that sort of multidisciplinarity?
I think that has certainly been historically true. I like to believe that is changing. And I certainly see with the next generation of talent coming up behind people like us, if I can put us in the same category, that they are inherently multidisciplinary in the way they're thinking. They don't like the idea of being put into a silo. So I think that the change has sort of begun and there's further to go. And this is exactly what, over a 50-year time frame, you could do something really transformational, as you say, rather than the sort of incremental progress. And that links to my second P, actually, which is purpose.
Yeah.
So I think that COVID has just really, it's shone a light on how powerful it can be when you have a very clear, compelling goal, a really shared imperative that people can unite around. And some of the rapid innovation that's taking place during this time has been absolutely, extraordinary examples of the effect of purpose on people's ability to do incredible things. And I would love us to harness that galvanizing effect for other compelling goals, climate change and how we live more sustainably on the planet being a really obvious example. And then my third P is partnership. So in the same way that we're talking about different disciplines, different professions working together, we need different groups of people, different institutions to work together. We need this systems approach. And one of the key interfaces will be between the public and the private sector. So just to give one specific example of where this could work better, public procurement. Government spends over £280 billion per annum in the UK on procurement. It's a whopping sum. And there's a real opportunity to use this better as a lever for research and innovation. I'm not the first to spot this. This is something lots of people have had a go at over many years. But I reckon in a 50-year time frame, we could really do something exciting there. And then lastly, I'll just chuck into the mix my two eyes. Firstly, infrastructure, physical and digital. So we've got a whole range of actors in our innovation ecosystem, from universities to catapults to national labs to industrial clusters and private sector labs. We've got some digital infrastructure and more on the way, we hope. And we need to build on what's there so that we have this humming system over the course of the 50 years. And then lastly, investment. How do we foster a healthy investment climate which is less afflicted by short-termism and more balanced in terms of who accesses finance, whether that be geographical, gender, racial, sectoral imbalances? And I'm going to say no on that because you know much more about that than I do.
Research is extremely broad. The UK has many strengths, which we're very fortunate to have. But I guess one key thing will be focus. If the UK is to have a really great 50-year research agenda, what are some of the areas where you think the UK really can have the most impact, given its strengths and opportunities?
Yeah, so if you take emerging tech, I would say that we have great creativity in the UK. We've got real underpinning strengths in our academic research base. We've got a huge number of talented people, and it's fantastic to see the efforts led by people like Tabitha Goldstab, who of course is intimately involved in CogX and co-chair of the AI Council, to complement those underpinning strengths with high ethical standards, transparency, a more diverse and inclusive community of researchers and innovators. I think that combination of sort of responsible societal strengths alongside the technical strengths creates a really great competitive offer for companies and researchers. And I am famous for being a relentless optimist amongst those that know me. So I do think that we underestimate what we have in the UK in terms of our innovation assets. If you look at us, for our size, we're really densely packed with institutions, people, assets that can help innovation. We're like a kind of cluster of clusters. And although there's of course scope for improvement, we have a good transport network. We're relatively well connected. Digital connectivity is improving. We're known world over for the strength of our academic research base. We've got clusters of entrepreneurial excellence that people like you have contributed to through EF, and the Academy through Orbit, through the Enterprise Hub that we host. We've got this strong culture of public engagement. We've got real strengths in humanities and social sciences, fantastic creative industries. I think what we need to do is to get a bit more kind of confident and joined up at bringing that package together back to the value assistance approach, and really crucially, having a shared narrative and a sort of marketing strategy that presents that offer to the global stage.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you say, if you look at the strength that we start with, particularly on the talent side, which, as you say, I think we should be celebrating more. It's whether it's AI and the fact that we have DeepMind literally kind of in the UK, or as you say, these other areas, it feels like the opportunity for a super ambitious agenda is there. We're almost out of time, but in the last sort of 30 seconds. What would you say, what is the one thing you would want policymakers to do differently as they look at the opportunity that we have now?
I think it's a good time for a reset to refresh our national narrative about the role research innovation plays and how we're going to tell that story to the world. Thanks,
Matt and Hayaton. And welcome back to Ed. Hello, Ed. You've been inside the government. You've seen how its mind works. There are occasionally sort of great big plans for grand research schemes running over decades. ARPA has been floating around this last year, thanks to Dominic Cummings. The stuff you've seen that may have passed over your desk, what works, what doesn't? When does something just crash and burn? And when do you think, actually, this is a plan that might work?
Well, I thought Hayaton said some really fascinating things during her discussion with Matt. And I, like her, am an optimist. So echoing what I said in our previous discussion, we shouldn't underestimate how incredibly well placed the United Kingdom is in these areas. And we do have a lot of things that work. But like her, I think you can't predict the future for the next 50 years. And what doesn't work are grand strategic plans by government. And I think, to be fair to previous governments, they have not done that. First of all, I think leadership from government is very important. We should remember we've had two brilliant science ministers in the last 15 years, Lord Sainsbury for the Labour government and David Willits for the Conservative government. And what they did is protect the research budget, which means that we still do have pure and applied research. But our interventions tend to be small scale, which I actually think is a good thing. Take something like Innovate UK, which has a relatively small budget, something like 100, 200 million, but gives grants to emerging startups in the field of science. I'm thinking of a company like Open Cosmos that makes small satellites. They are effective. Big schemes do work for big science, and they particularly work in terms of international collaboration, thinking about the nuclear fusion research that goes on at Cullen. But what wouldn't work would be a kind of massive, over-budget, big institution coming from nowhere. But to be fair, I don't think we've done that, actually, in the last 10 years. Things like the Ada Lovelace Institute, the Alan Turing Institute, are not massive scale projects.
The narrative. Great. Ed, thank you ever so much. I'll come back to you shortly. Now, the world hasn't seen a global research project like it, the search for the COVID vaccine. Europe, the US, Russia, public and private, working tirelessly. The couple behind the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine stopped only for an hour to get married. But is this a race for global health, or is it a race for global wealth? Considering this question is Varun Mathur. He's a technology fellow at the AI Now Institute, and we heard from Varun earlier.
Look, the history of coronavirus research globally doesn't start in 2020. It actually starts well before that. Let's go back to 2011, when the research arm for the United States Department of Defense, called DARPA, poured in $33 million into then CureVac's initial attempts at looking at an mRNA vaccine, which is what ultimately led to what we now know as Moderna's vaccine attempt. Let's go to 2016 and 2017, for example, when the National Institutes of Health, which is the research arm for the United States government, poured in millions of dollars to understand how to target spike proteins. Those spike proteins that look like crowns are what gives coronavirus its name. And that same research is also in the same patents for Pfizer, in Moderna, in CureVac, and so many others. I mean, it's very clear that the United States, at least the United States taxpayer, has poured in millions of dollars into this research. And that's not just where the story stops. Now, if you look at what we've done globally, look at BARDA, for example, which is the United States research arm for the United States Health and Human Services, has poured in $14.5 billion already into coronavirus research up until this point. And that's just the United States, right? The EU and the UK both have poured in billions, in at least $1 billion into what is AstraZeneca's attempt at a vaccine. The facts are, I think, very clear here. I think the story of how much money from taxpayers have gone into coronavirus research long before the pandemic started, and that will continue long after it, shows that there is a public stake in the ownership of this vaccine that's going to be developed. So the question isn't how much money have we poured in, and what is owed for the public at large, but what are the legal tools for public servants to do their job to put people at the fore of the pandemic, right? So there's one attempt at this, right? Compulsory licensing, which allows for governments to forcibly manufacture third-party versions of the drug, the vaccine, depending on whether or not they need to, right? So an example of this is in 2001, during the anthrax scare. The United States government was faced with pharmaceutical company Bayer, which was at the time manufacturing ciprofloxacin, which was necessary to combat the anthrax scare at the time for people. It was being manufactured for less than $1, but it was being sold for $2. And the United States government couldn't handle this. So they threatened compulsory licensing. And that is what turned Bayer down and said, okay, we're going to deal with the United States government. The EU and the WTO have both recognized compulsory licensing as important legal tools when ensuring that a coronavirus vaccine is affordable to everybody, right? And that's just compulsory licensing. Think about in the United States, we have another law called the Bayh-Dole Act, right? In return for clearing the path for private patenting of taxpayer-funded research, this law has provisions for governments to march in on patents that derive from taxpayer-funded research if a pharmaceutical company has not made that technology available under reasonable terms. Now, reasonable terms, by all intents and means available at affordable cost. Now, we have an example of a company having to backtrack on this very point. Look at Moderna, for example, talking a big game about pandemic pricing, right, of their vaccine when people were scared that the pricing of the vaccine would be too high for people. In their SEC filing soon after, they had to state that we cannot be certain that we were the first to file for patent protections because the NIH, the United States public arm, actually claimed joint ownership of the IP, right? So governments are taking unprecedented steps already when they don't want to, even sometimes, to ensure that they recognize that the public have an IP stake in this. And so the question for us really is, what are we going to do about making sure that a vaccine is affordable? I think everybody recognizes the importance of pharmaceutical manufacturing, pharmaceutical cooperation and partnership, and they should make money on this vaccine. There's no doubt about that. The question is how much, and recognizing whether or not they are the priority, or is the priority the fact that vaccines don't save people's lives? Vaccinations do. And I think recognizing that public leaders are at a crossroads, a crisis that they're probably never going to face after this ever again. The history will judge the actions that they take right now. Do they make sure that vaccines are free, that they don't bankrupt small and middle income countries, that they're affordable to everyone, and that we ensure that equity as the central helm of a pandemic response to a global crisis?
Thanks, Varun. And to take on this question and more around issues of the vaccine are two sages of the healthcare world. We're the healthcare and research world. We're delighted to have Sally Mossman from GSK and Nicola Blackwood, who is chair of Genomics England and also a member of the House of Lords.
Well, thank you, Joy, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here with you today. My name is Nicola Blackwood. I am chair of Genomics England and a survivor of many years in politics and government, most recently as Life Sciences Minister. And I'm delighted to be here today with Sally Mossman. She is joining us today from Rockville, Maryland, where she heads GSK's Global Vaccine R&D Center. Welcome, Sally. Now, Sally, this has been the most extraordinary time for vaccine development. I think there was probably a global sigh of relief, which could have been heard from space, when the news was coming out from Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca that we are really now starting to see some positive news coming out about the vaccine, and there's the potential for us to start returning to normal life. And you have been right at the heart of this. I really can't imagine what it has been like living through this at the coalface. As a true believer in the power of life sciences to transform the health of nations, I think one of the most positive aspects of this whole extraordinary experience has been the deep international collaboration between governments and health systems and researchers and pharma. But I don't think watching it is anything like experiencing it. So can you just give us a little bit of an idea of what you have been up to and what it has really felt like to be on the front line?
Hello, Nicola. Thank you. Yes, delighted to be here. No, it has been an extraordinary time, as you say, and I think I couldn't agree with you more that this collective sigh of relief around the success of Moderna and AZ, etc., in terms of the efficacy that they've demonstrated on these vaccines. And I think, as an employee of GSK, a vaccine company, I think our position on this, we are very, very active in the COVID vaccine space, but we fully believe that it's going to take many vaccines to be successful to really tackle this global problem. And so, yes, as being on the front lines, indeed. So I'm head of an R&D facility here in Rockville, Maryland. And so we've really been juggling our efforts towards a COVID vaccine. We've been juggling running a facility where we have lab employees coming in all the time, of course, and so very concerned about being able to keep them safe. And at the same time, of course, as a commercial company, we need to keep the rest of the business going as well. So it's been an extremely busy time, an exhilarating time as well, though, as we see the incredible breakthroughs that are happening in terms of vaccine technologies, the accelerated pace of development. I think there will be some good things that come out of this pandemic in terms of what it means for vaccines. And I would say the increased scrutiny on vaccines as a really important public health measure.
Well, I mean, this is something, what has been extraordinary was the pace and scale with which vaccine development accelerated in order to respond to the challenge which we were facing. And obviously that wouldn't be possible if there wasn't already strong underlying systems in place in many nations. And so what is interesting to try and understand is, what do you think, as somebody who's on the delivery side, is important for, what are the important key elements for business to get right in order to stimulate innovation? What do you think governments need to get right in order to create the kind of ecosystem to stimulate the kind of discovery that is necessary to respond to these kind of crises when they emerge out of the blue?
Yeah, and I think we were able to respond so quickly to this situation because a lot of those underlying innovations were already there, both in terms of the vaccine technologies as well as some really basic research that had happened in terms of related viruses to COVID-19. So from a business side, I think what's key to innovation is really having the right culture within the company, and I think that has to come from the very top. It has to come from management. I think there needs to be a framework where innovation is recognized and rewarded. Ideas coming, of course, from our own scientists, but really critically external collaborations. And it's very often that interplay between, a university or a government-funded institute and our own scientists that can really stimulate innovation. Another key component that we think is really important is tolerating failure. So the encouraging of taking some smart risks, that's really important in terms of stimulating innovation within a company. And then the other thing I would note there is the funding. So we have to make sure that we're funding the early research work and not always prioritizing the allocation of the R&D investment into the more late stage programs. So I think within a company, that's what's really important for innovation, as well as understanding what problem you're trying to solve. right? So that you're kind of channeling the innovative ideas towards fixing problems. In this case, it was all around, how can it be easier to make and to research and develop vaccines and bring them to patients in a timely way. And this is where all of the innovation around the RNA technology and viral vector technologies. And from a government perspective, I think, partnership with governments has been key for many, many years in terms of stimulating innovation within vaccines businesses. And I think, there are policies in place like direct funding of R&D or stimulating those cooperative relationships between government-funded universities or in research institutes together with the private sector. Things like, tax credits for research and development, securing intellectual property rights for companies is absolutely key to make it a sustainable business model. So those are some of the things that I think really help in the interplay between industry and governments in terms of stimulating innovation.
So it's interesting, you spoke about risk tolerance there and the need for business to tolerate more risk within its portfolio. Now, governments are not well known for tolerating risk, but what has been interesting is the accelerated pace of development. And many people listening will want to know that the vaccine development has still proceeded with the appropriate level of safety and scrutiny over that development. And so when you're talking about risk in the vaccine development, can you just kind of define what you mean by that?
That's a great, yes, thank you. And risk, of course, I'm talking about the very, very early innovation, right? It's risk in terms of, perhaps trying something in the lab that may not be 100% sure to succeed. I'm not talking about risk in terms of execution of clinical trials. It's absolutely key. I think everybody agrees that patient safety is first and foremost the most important thing. And, and clinical trials are inherently designed to start with small numbers of subjects before going to larger numbers of subjects. And that approach has been maintained through COVID vaccine development. And of course, I think it's through very close and careful interaction with the regulators that we can do these types of things at pace, where regulators are able to maybe eliminate some of the more timely procedures without compromising patient safety.
Well, that's an important point, because if we have managed to eliminate some of the unnecessary bureaucracy in order to accelerate discovery in vaccines and get to phase 3 and possibly towards rollout during this period, what is it that we have learned about improving vaccine discovery during this COVID period that can perhaps be transferred into future vaccine discovery? Because this is not going to be the only pandemic challenge or outbreak challenge that we face. And also we have other priorities that we might want to move this learning into, whether it's a universal flu vaccine or the challenges of AMR. And we don't want to lose the extraordinary learnings that we've had in the last few months.
I think that's true, but I think it's important to recognize that not all of the shortcuts that were taken on COVID will necessarily be readily applied in, more traditional preventive vaccine development. And I think, here risk benefit is absolutely key, right? So in the current situation where it's imperative to go quickly, this is where, we were able to take, for example, do some toxicology studies in parallel with the phase 1 study based on a body of previously available clinical data suggesting minimal risk. So those are the types of decisions that could be taken between vaccine companies and regulators that allowed us to go faster. If we were coming with a completely new technology or a completely new approach, we obviously would not, there wouldn't be an appetite for taking that kind of risk. So I think it really does depend on the body of evidence available to allow that type of appropriate judgment call. But I couldn't agree with you more. I think there are many, many learnings from the way that we've been able to respond in the current situation that we need to hang on to and that we need to be able to apply moving forwards. And I would say, you know, the development and validation of some of these technology platforms will absolutely transform vaccine development moving forwards. If I look at the shingles vaccine from GSK, Shingrix, that took 10 to 15 years to develop. And here we've seen COVID vaccines come from, you know, first viral sequence to clinical efficacy data within a matter of months. That's absolutely incredible. And a big part of that is these technology platforms. You know, messenger RNA is a platform that is really simplifying the manufacturing approach. That we will keep, you know, that the utilization of that technology, it truly is a plug and play platform. So we won't need to reinvent those processes every time around. It's really, I think, removing some of the barriers to entry that were previously in place due to the need to manufacture complex biologicals. So there's no question this will transform the vaccines business.
Well, this leads us on to, you know, a really knotty question, really, about access. And obviously, we've just heard from Varun Mathur from the AI Now Institute talking about the questions of public-private partnerships in terms of development and how this leads to questions about value. And so in terms of ensuring that vaccines are distributed and financially accessible to all in order to ensure equity, what roles do you think all the different partners in vaccine development should be playing to make sure that we achieve that equity of access when what we're talking about is a life-saving product?
The mission of COVAX is to ensure, you know, accelerated supply of vaccines and equitable access as well as affordable pricing for countries across the globe. And I think more than 180 nations have actually signed up to COVAX. GSK and Sanofi in our collaborative partnership have signed a letter of intent for support to COVAX, and we've actually committed 200 million doses of vaccine to enable, you know, this equitable supply of vaccine across the globe. And I think, you know, it's absolutely essential that governments are thinking not just about national infrastructure and national supply. We really need to be thinking about the global approach to addressing this pandemic, but also the next pandemic, because I think everybody believes this will not be the last one.
And I mean, we're coming to the end. We have a very short amount of time left. So you've mentioned some technological changes which have occurred in recent years, and really their value has been realized in response to this pandemic. You've mentioned some changes in terms of the way in which different partners have operated in response to this pandemic, with significantly more collaboration, both nationally and internationally. What do you think will be different in terms of vaccine development going forward? Are you optimistic? Do you think development will be faster? And do you think we are in a good position to respond to future threats?
While I think there will from a long-term perspective, there will always be a need for competition between companies, because I think that's part of the sustainability of the model. It's also what often drives time to market and drives innovation. But in terms of future pandemic preparedness, I do think we need to be thinking global network, collaboration, funding to make this a sustainable approach where we can have kind of a warm infrastructure that is working for the most part on these mainstream vaccines, but that can rapidly pivot towards rapid response when the need arises. So am I optimistic? I'm optimistic that all the conditions are right to make it happen, but there needs to be a will to support it and to fund it. And there's a big role for governments in there as well.
Sally, thank you so much for your time. That's been an absolutely fascinating glimpse at the operation of building a vaccine that will save lives. Now we just have to make sure it's available for all. Thank you very much for your time. And
my pleasure.
Joy.
Thanks, Nicola, and thank you, Sally. Ed, I thought it was a fascinating discussion, particularly in the change in working practices, where essentially what we were talking about earlier, that small biotech companies could actually join up with big pharma companies. There seem to be kind of new routes through. COVID has sort of shaken up how we practice. It's a force of disruption, but potentially for good.
Oh, absolutely. And it echoes a bit what Hayatun was saying earlier about public procurement. I mean, in terms of, for example, the government digital service, which I know sounds like I'm going on a huge tangent here. One of the revolutions there was to procure from SMEs, much smaller SMEs, and get away from the oligopoly of big IT companies. And similarly, while I think obviously GSK is a marvelous global British company, I think the recognition there that you can join the big with the small, and the elephant and the mouse, as it were, can work together in a collaborative fashion is fantastic, because anyone who looks at the tech world knows that you've got big heavy companies, but you've also got flexible entrepreneurial startups who have particular niches and expertise. And if you can find a way to crack that conundrum and bring them together, you see what happens. You get extraordinary breakthroughs.
So the race for the vaccine, it's is the race for public health, and that is a good thing, and it's a public good. But it's also, in a sense, a race for global reputation. How do you think that the Oxford vaccine is going to feed into the narrative that we would like, post-Brexit in particular, of the UK having a competitive advantage, in this case, in life sciences?
Well, I think I think what has been a theme through all these discussions is actually the UK is fantastically well placed. We have an extraordinary reputation in research and biomedical research, and I'm not one that particularly wants to bang the drum to say, isn't it great that the Oxford vaccine is Britain at its best and we're better than anybody else? Because this is a collaborative effort, and if you lift up the bonnet and look at the people who worked on the Oxford vaccine, I can guarantee you will find scientists from pretty much every nation in the world. But nevertheless, again, going back to Hayatun, her remarks have really stuck with me. This narrative, we've had the great campaign, which we did off the back of the Olympics, to sell Britain abroad as a place to invest. And I think that I'm extremely proud that Oxford has produced this vaccine. But if we can also, to be frank, riff off the back of it in narrative about how the UK is a fantastic place for pure science and applied science, then so much the better. And that is something that I hope we'll do without sort of patriotic breastbeating and wearing Union Jack vests, just making the point that we have this extraordinary infrastructure built up over decades and decades that is, to coin a phrase, world beating, and it's something that we should use to market Britain as a place to invest and a place where companies can base their headquarters and benefit from this kind of research.
That's great, Ed. That's both optimism and British modesty tied in together, which is a very good way to see. So that's all from CogX Spotlight this week. A huge thank you to Ed for joining me. And do remember that you can subscribe to the Vasey View. And you can also come and join us again next week, when we will turn our focus to education with guests including Rutger Bregman, who is the acclaimed author of Utopia for Realists. Thanks for joining us, and see you next Wednesday.